All right, so I'm going to start today talking a bit about what we experienced over the last couple of days. So we haven't really done a lot of training with regards to how to think about games. This was just you with your experience of critical thinking, playing games, any games that you have designed on your own in the past, but taking a game with a very large design space and going off and exploring that design space. So does anyone want to share the rules that you added, the rules that you played around with, and kind of the outcome of how you felt like that went? Let's go here.
Me and my teammate found that like the most exciting part of the game is the tension and dice rolls. So we were just trying to find ways to have increase the amount of times you can feel tension.
Yeah.
So like we put shops at the end of each row, and then you could collect a token each time, and you could choose to like bank your tokens if you wanted. And then we had a range of items you could pick. So like the two coolest items we had is like one of them would like set all the red squares to be sort of like snakes basically for one turn, and both players had to roll on that turn. And if you landed on a red square, you had to go down 2 rows. And then the other one, because we were trying to find patterns, like different patterns you could sort of contaminate, either in a positive or a negative way. And like one of the positive ones we had is like if you land on any square with a 5 or a 0, you get to move up to the next row until you find the next 5 or 0. So it's like we had a positive and a negative one. So like I feel like those were the funnest mechanics we found. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed I saw it as a catch-up mechanic. You take a snake, it feels bad, but it gives you the ability now to, when you go up those rows, now have the ability to gain tokens that you could use to mess with your opponent or to give yourself a further advantage. And I thought that was really cool.
And if you fall down, like if you hit a snake, then you can still collect the token at the end of that row. So you can like save up your tokens. So,
yeah, and it got more and more powerful. You designed really well what different tokens could do. You had a 1 token outcome, a 2 token outcome, a 3 outcome. So you could determine, is it worth saving it up or is it worth getting a more smaller benefits?
Yeah.
And that was very situational. So there was a lot of critical thinking and strategy necessary.
We had another one too, which is like if you wanted to spend like 1 token, you could buy 1 single row ladder. You could collect pieces of ladders to build big ladders. So if you ever fell all the way to the bottom, you saved all your ladders, then you could just get right back into the game. So but
very interesting. It makes it feel, I think one thing in general that's very useful in game design is to make sure that every player feels like they are in the game at all points in time. If someone is so far behind that they know they're going to lose the game, why are you still engaging in the game? The outcome has been determined. The game should be over. So either allow someone who is behind to get back in the game, which they feel like if I get lucky, then I'm back in the game. That gives them some hope, something to strive for, aim for, save up for. And the person who's ahead doesn't feel safe in that lead. If the person who's behind gets lucky with this, then it's a close game. So I need to continue to make really important decisions on how to end this game as quickly as possible so that I can take my lead and win with it. Yeah.
So we had a few different rules that we're adding to the game. And the main one we worked on was instead of having a 1d6, we're using a 2d6 system. And so whenever you are about to roll for your movement, you declared that you're going to either crawl or sprint. And it was very similar to anyone who's played D&D, rolling with disadvantage or advantage. Since in certain board positions, if you're like really close to a ladder, then you'd want to be rolling with disadvantage where you're accepting the lower dice roll rather than the higher dice roll. But if like, you're really close to a snake, then you'd be wanting to go further. Or if there's just nothing ahead of you, then you want to be getting those bigger dice rolls. And that added a lot of like engagement to the game since you were having to actually think about your position in any way. And then we also noticed a lot of times, since it's only D6, is surprisingly common to roll doubles on it. And so we also added a rule where when you rolled a double, you made your movement as normal, but then you also chose any player to move forward or backward that amount. So if you rolled like double 6s, then you could just move forward 12 spaces, or you could move forward the 6 spaces and then move someone else backward 6 spaces. And so it made some positions where if you got lucky, you could hope, if you're wanting to like hope to be lucky, you could hope to like get 2 1s or something and push someone backwards into a snake or forward into a snake.
Yeah, there's reason to actually pay attention to where your opponent is. On the base rules of snakes and ladders, your opponent might as well not exist. there's no interaction with them. But as soon as you can start to move their piece or manipulate their location in some capacity, you care about how far away from the snake, not just how close am I to the goal. Cool. Yeah.
For mine, I decided to do you have an option. I decided to give more options, make the board significantly more challenging to traverse, but give the player more options by having the ability to choose to roll 2d6s and not choose but pick one of them, or roll a d10. I mean, it was a d12 for a while. That was a little too fast. And then there was just a bunch of like fun little spaces I came up with, like the swap space. So that could be a good thing or a bad thing, sort of. And then there was like a bonus dice space and a penalty dice space. I just kind of tried Mario Party.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, for mine, I was kind of going for, I decided to do like a single player roguelike kind of thing. They call it like Snake Trail, where basically it would be like a randomly generated board and all the snakes and ladders are invisible. So you have to go roll and basically discover where stuff is. It's kind of that part of map finding kind of mechanic.
Huh.
And every time you would take a snake, you might like die, but then you could go to a shop and then like get items that would make playing it like it's that roguelike kind of progression of like
Interesting.
giving yourself more tools
Okay.
to conquer a map basically.
Interesting. Very interesting. And then you can use a seed to generate the seed-based system to generate the map from the beginning. Very interesting digital version of the game. Yeah.
So we didn't change the mechanics of the game a lot, but we added a betting feature. So roulette, where on each turn you can bet whether you land on a matter of white piece or a multiple of 1 or 2 or 3. Whatever. You can make it other rules with that too.
Okay. So yeah, getting a sense of where am I? What are the roles within the window? What should I bet on? Especially given how far behind you are, you can take a higher risk, higher reward potentially in order to help with the catch-up mechanic. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, and also like multiple players, you can have 3 or more players, where maybe there's just one piece of 3 people are betting on which position the position the marker representing.
Could you gamble on your opponent's moves? That could be kind of interesting.
I think that would be, yeah, you could do that too.
I'll bet you're going to hit that snake.
Yeah.
And if you do, then I can surpass you because of the benefit that I get for being right in the gamble. Yeah, there's a lot you could play around with that. That's a very big design space in and of itself. Anyone else?
We needed so ladders have to be clear for you to traverse them. That you could skip a roll at any time if you're on a ladder to strategically block your opponent.
Yeah, that's right. I remember this. So if your opponent is somewhere up the ladder, blocking you from getting to the top of the ladder, you can't climb the ladder. Yeah, that's a very cool idea.
Me and my partner, we came up with an idea to have like a separate dice that would have different options where you could move either yourself or your opponent to augment the dice rolls.
Yeah.
It allowed us to have more agency in the game. So the game slowed down because instead of just rolling the dice and looking at everything, you were analyzing, like thinking of like, what can I do to try to mess with the odds and all that kind of stuff. And then it did lead to longer games sometimes because you'd just be sabotaging each other. But yeah.
I saw you two gifting each other some things as well. It was almost so interesting that you felt bad for your opponent. Like, here, I'm going to help you out. So it almost turned into something competitive, cooperative. I was surprised that no one took a cooperative route to the game. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a player versus player. You could be working together for some aspects in this as well. But I did not see that from anyone that I talked to. Every year, I try to design a different game myself than I've designed in the past. And then I also like to take inspiration from some of the ideas that I hear around as I'm going around, and I try to combine them and then change them in a bit to make a new game. This year's game for me is a territory battle where you have a white player and a red player, You start out with exactly the cells as they are, and that is your territory. Whenever you land on a square of your opponent's territory, you convert it to your own. The first player who reaches the end does not win the game by default. That ends the game, and the player with the most territory wins the game. So one player, the player with the most territory, is actively trying to end the game and win, and the other player is actively trying to avoid winning and put themselves in a position where they could strategically take ladders or snakes to put themselves in parts of the board where there are more of their opponent's pieces than their own before they have to go get to the end and win the game. That said, there's some interesting strategy that involves, there's kind of a lack of strategy, so I've tried to add some strategy to this, but one of the interesting scenarios that I thought up while doing this was at the very end, the player who is behind, if they're on that last row, would be actively wanting to roll and hit a snake, because otherwise they could accidentally go win the game or go end the game, and they're not in a position to win the game. So a snake in the last row suddenly becomes a desirable outcome. Then I stole Lily's idea of advantage and disadvantage, but with a bit of a twist. So because of this, there might be more of your territory earlier on or later on, and you might want to roll with advantage or disadvantage. You might want to hit a snake, really want to hit a snake or not hit a snake. So I wanted there to be some downside. The default is you roll a single die and you take that as your roll. On the other hand, you could roll with advantage or disadvantage. If you choose to do that, you give your opponent an extra turn after your own turn. So there becomes a consideration of, is it really worth it for me to hit this snake? That becomes very useful at the end of the game if you're trying to win the game or lose the game, to try to avoid or take snakes. But it gives the player a little bit more agency in making it more likely or less likely to have a bit more control over where they are on the board, but it's still not perfect control. So that's kind of what I came up with.
What happens if somebody that has 2 turns? Because their opponent just took the advantage.
So if they do that or not,
If they do that and then they use advantage on both of those turns.
oh no, yeah. So you get those 2 turns. So it becomes kind of like if you with your first extra turn use advantage or disadvantage, it cancels it out. So your opponent gets the extra turn, and now instead of you taking 2 turns in a row, they get a turn in between those extra turns. So you can either trade off advantage or disadvantage, or if one person is just taking luck because they're behind and it doesn't really matter, there's more of the opponent's territory than their own, it doesn't matter where I land, I'll flip a cell no matter what, then it becomes a catch-up thing.
This is like more of an aesthetic choice, but another thing me and my teammate had is like to reduce clutter. We thought it would be cool if, like, on the squares you just had an icon for a ladder or a snake and then a number of where you move to, so that way it's just not so hideous to look at the board.
Yeah.
It's so confusing with all the information,
It'd be much easier in a digital game. There are quite a few limitations with the physical board in front of you that I think a couple of teams tried to work with in terms of snakes and ladders that could move around the board. But yeah, you had to cut out your own paper and move that around in order. It made it very difficult to engage with as a physical game. That would make a lot more sense if you could slide them around digitally in a digital representation of the game. Any other thoughts on this exercise?
It's hard to recontextualize the rolling of the dice part. It's like there's always it feels like there's always an element of luck.
Yeah. So you do have control over that a little bit. You could have our advantage disadvantage system and have a little bit of control over it, or it might be nice if you could spend some resource to guarantee some outcome or something like that. There are ways to get around the feeling of it's out of my hands, and there are lots of game design elements where that's really a spectrum between pure luck and pure skill. You can create systems where your game falls somewhere in the middle. Yeah. So the purpose of this was just to get our design brains going. Not really a great outcome from this, because we're going to start talking about games in a bit more detail, but I find that this really does start to get you thinking like a designer. And just like we said on a couple of slides before this, a couple of days ago, how players and designers think about games from kind of the opposite side of design. How a player first engages with a game is different from how a designer first engages with the game. So let's talk a little bit more about the elements of game design. So I introduced Tracy Fullerton as one of the, she's a professor at USC, does her own game design. But she created this formal, dramatic, and dynamic elements. And so she says that games are really made up of three types of elements. The formal elements are these elements that differentiate a game from other forms of media. That provides the structure of the game rather than the structure that we have watching a show or a movie, something else like that. So the fact there are rules, the fact there are resources to collect and spend. There are boundaries within the game of either something like where the rules change, you're in this age, then you're in this age, there's this rule set and then this rule set as the game adapts. There are different rules as your character unlocks additional powers or additional abilities. And there are dramatic elements, just your story and narrative elements. So premise, where is the game taking place? What is the background of that? They help the players understand where they are, what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, why the rules make sense given the world that they are in. And it really helps the player to become invested in the outcome of the game. If you're just like snakes and ladders, doesn't really have a cohesive premise. It doesn't really make sense to be climbing ladders and going down snakes. But in some other games, there's an atmosphere. There's a feeling of that you are taking on a role. You are attempting to accomplish something. So you can become more emotionally invested in the outcome because of that background. There are the dynamic elements. Once we turn the rules into actual gameplay, how does strategy emerge from that? How do players choose to interact with the rules? What are the differences between a player's game piece or their game character and the resources within the game? There is a bit of a difference, as she states in her book, about the difference between MDA, mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, and the dynamic elements listed here, just because we're looking at more than just how do the mechanics work during that runtime behavior. We're looking at more the actual strategy, the behavior, the relationship between them. So it's meant to be a bit more broadly defined. We're going to dive into each of these in a bit more detail as we talk about how do we think about each of these in more. So 7 different elements that differentiate games from other media. We can first look at the player interaction pattern. So how do players interact with other players and or the game? This is where player versus environment, the PvE, comes in. You can either have a 1v1 competition, a team versus team, a multilateral free-for-all, unilateral, there's one evil player and a bunch of players trying to defeat the evil player. Cooperative settings, competitive settings in different ways, shapes, or forms. Multiple players working together against a system. Any of those are player interaction patterns. How are the players supposed to engage with each other as they work toward the outcome of the game? Questions on different interaction patterns? This is where objectives come in. Other media doesn't really have an objective, but in a game, there is an objective. Each player is trying to do something at a given point in time. What are those players trying to achieve? How do we determine when the game is over? And how do we determine a score or who won based on when the game ends? What was that outcome? The rules. What's allowed, what's not allowed. Some rules are explicitly stated, others may be implicitly stated. Like there is no rule in the rule book of Monopoly that says players cannot steal from the bank. It's implicitly assumed that if you don't have the money, you can't just steal the money or just steal it from other players. If they're not looking, you can take their money. That's not stated anywhere. So implicitly defined rule. There are procedures. What can be done by the player? This is separate from the rules, but how do you put the rules together into a larger scale procedure? It can be interactions between multiple rules. It could even be something that isn't stated, that's outside the realm of the rules itself. So something like bluffing in poker is an example of a procedure. It's something that emerges. It isn't specifically defined in the rules of poker, but it's something that emerges from the strategy of playing poker because it could give you an advantage if it is done well. Then there are the game resources. Whatever has value in the game. Could be an element that can be spent, an element that can be traded for something that by itself does something of value to the outcome of the game. Examples, money, health, items, property, something that has value in the game. Boundaries, where does the game end and reality begin? So something like virtual reality is an interesting way of noting you're trying to blend reality with the game, where the motions that you take in reality affect the motions in the game. It could also be sports, a game that is played in real life. Where does the game end and reality begin? Usually when you get injured. But it could also be something like if you get so frustrated playing a sport that you walk over and smack the other player in the face. That's where the game has ended, and now you're inflicting damage on the person, not on the person's game object, piece, something that blends that reality of where the game and reality mesh. So where is that line?
I think Hockey would disagree.
Yeah, hockey would probably disagree. That's a good point. Violence is part of the game. Boxing would disagree.
Yeah. I mean, with boxing, that is the game.
Yes. Well, one might argue in hockey that is the game as well. Yes, we lost the game. We took out 2 of their players. It's a moral victory. Finally, there's the outcome. How did the game end? There could be a final outcome where a player wins, another player loses, or you receive a score at the end of the game. There could also be incremental outcomes where you have the option of ending the game or not ending the game. Something that is scored in that sense could also somehow be incremental. So it's either over or it's not. It's over with a particular score, and different paths through the game can achieve different scores, and you can rank how well you did in the game based on that score. So a zero-sum game like chess, zero-sum here just means that anything that one player gains, the other player by definition loses. Any piece that you capture of your opponents in chess is another piece of advantage that you have over them. D&D has incremental outcomes. The game is not over when you defeat an enemy. It is an option to gain experience, to level up, to gain some new abilities, to move on to the next adventure, to go back and turn in the quest of defeating that enemy and increase your reputation. When you gain a level and unlock a new skill point, how do you spend that skill point? That is an outcome of the game, but it is not a terminal outcome. It is something that is just part of the game's progression. So those are all formal elements. They're all designed. From the designer's perspective, it's something that you are responsible for as you design the game. Any questions on formal elements? I think I didn't animate that correctly. It's all here at once. Thematic elements are premise, character, and story. For the premise, what is the background of the story of the game world? What is happening? What is the history of this world? Who are these characters? They weren't just born. They didn't just come into existence. They have a backstory. There is a cultural backstory. Something has happened to put the people who are in this game in the position that they are in. Not every game has a premise. Some of the premises for this are like, what is the premise of chess? It is a simplistic battle simulator. But how did these pieces get here? It's not necessary for the premise. What do these pieces represent? Why can they move the way that they can move? Not important. So sometimes your premise doesn't have to be overly complicated. Sometimes a little can say a lot. Sometimes a lot can say a lot.
But even though in the case of chess, even though it doesn't need any of that, it still kind of has it in a way.
Yeah,
It's
it
like
does.
the king and the queen in
But the names of the pieces,
Right.
it gives you some context, a little bit of context. It's not specific context, but it's enough to motivate why this is a battle. You want to win this battle. You want to capture the opponent's king. So go ahead and write the premise of your favorite game in a single sentence. I'm curious as to what people can do with a single sentence without stating the name of the game. And then the game will be, if you say the premise, we'll see if other people can guess what the game is based on that one sentence of the premise. Anyone want to share? Go one, then
Yeah.
two.
Green super soldier works with an uncommon ally to save the universe from giant hula hoops.
Anyone have a sense of what that might be?
Did you say that again?
Green super soldier works with an uncommon ally to save the universe from giant hula hoops.
Oh, is that Halo?
Yes.
Halo, excellent.
Futuristic world where humans are at war with aliens called Formix, and kids are recruited to command armies and battles.
Interesting. Anyone know what that is?
Did you say that again?
Futuristic world where humans are at war with aliens called Formix, and kids are recruited to command armies and battles.
Warhammer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll go Lily, then one, two, three.
Saving an infected kingdom after the late king's containment plan fails.
Ooh. Nathan knows
Hollow
it.
Knight, Hollow Knight.
Yeah.
Very nice.
A high schooler and his friends infiltrate the subconscious of bad people to get them to confess their crimes.
I know that one.
Ooh, what is it?
Persona 5.
Nice. Yep. Simon?
Two teams enter multiple other worlds to stop a calamity prophesied in humans.
Destiny.
No.
Other thoughts on that one?
Can you say it again?
Two teams enter multiple other worlds to stop a calamity prophesied in legends.
With incompatibles.
Yeah.
Just Doctor in.
All right, we'll go one, then two, then three. Yeah.
Get revenge on the guy who shot you in the head and buried you in shallow.
That's Tom.
Nice, nice. Devin?
We got a space hero saves the universe from evil machine gods.
We have a couple of ones.
It's a comic.
Anyone? Repeat it.
Space hero saves the universe from evil machine gods.
I think you stumped us. What is it?
Aspect.
Mass.
Oh.
There we go. Everyone goes, oh, I should have known that.
I think a lot of games have that story.
Yeah.
Escape from an underground science lab in the desert from experiences from potatoes on Earth.
You know what that is?
Just halfway.
Half-Life, is it? Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Cool. We have one remotely. Uncover the story of your fractured world through a single-player visual novel and become the champion savior of said world through multiplayer battle content. By the nature of knowing this person, I know what it is. Uncover the story of your fractured world through a single-player visual novel and become the champion savior of said world through multiplayer battle content.
Genshin Impact. Is it risky?
It isn't.
Kiva that said that or was it?
Kiva said that.
It's not this bad.
Seems like we're stumped.
I don't know.
That is Final Fantasy 14.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone here?
You wake up in a wagon, headed to your.
Stop there. Skyrim. Everyone knows. It's quick.
Zombie battles gods to perpetuate a curse.
To perpetuate what?
A curse. A curse.
This really sounds like Dark Souls.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Dark Souls. It's fun. We have a really easy one online. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Car soccer.
Oh,
That's great. So we have Rocket League. Excellent. Anyone else? All right. So the premise can actually reasonably, very frequently be described in a single sentence, and it sets itself apart from other games. I think that's the takeaway that I like to think about with regards to premise. If you can design something that someone can say in one sentence that differentiates your game from every other game that's been made, that's a pretty solid win. But it also shows you the broad different premises that exist in successful games that are out there. So next we have character. So who is important in this story? Who is the story about? Who do they know? Who is relevant to them? How do we progress the story through the use of these characters? So in movies, you're supposed to empathize with a particular protagonist. Instead, in games, you often are that protagonist. You make decisions as that protagonist. So you are responsible for the decisions that they make. So you have to now choose as a designer whether you take on kind of the more movie, is the game scripted and you're taking the role of this protagonist, but it's more the world revolves around you and you're taking the role of that player in the decisions that character makes. Or are you making decisions for that character and the story that unfolds is based on the decisions that character makes and you make by association? So are you trying to act as that character, trying to put yourself in their shoes, make decisions that they would, given their background, given the story that's happened so far? There's a lot of power in that. Are you trying to put your own personality in an avatar, in a character, in a fantastical world? And are you interacting in that world as yourself? Oftentimes, that is a very important design decision. What are you trying to have the player experience? Don't try to do all of the above because you will not be able to do it all well. Yeah.
Really interesting, like, subversion of this character idea is in Deltarune. Since the player character Chris, I've played chapters 3 and 4, only 1 and 2. But you play as basically a soul controlling Chris. You're not actually playing as the character in the universe Chris. And so it's clear to other characters that Chris is acting differently. But Chris is the only one that can have any idea like why. And it's because there's some other force controlling them.
Interesting. That leads to a lot of player agency as well. It feels like your choices matter. Are you trying to confuse the people around you as to why you're acting so differently? Are you trying to blend in? Are you trying to, that allows for a lot of space, it seems like, for world building. Yeah, finally we have story. What actually happens in the game, the plot of the game. Once we have the premise and the characters, how do the events of the game shape the characters' developments? What happens? So those are the dramatic elements. Finally, we have our dynamic elements. We have the idea of emergence. What happens when simple rules meet with a player who has a complex brain? So some examples within Snakes and Ladders. What emerges from the simple rules of Snakes and Ladders? If one player lucks into a bunch of ladders and the other player hits only, this is for the chutes and ladders, oops, only hits snakes, what is the experience for both players? The emergence of this is that it feels unfair. Even though it's just luck, there is no player agency whatsoever, just the natural emergence of the rules, the unfairness can become emergent. It seems like rather than fate against player A, if player 2 spends every move setting player A back with some rules that we have designed that might allow you to set player A back, rather than player B trying to win the game, if player B is trying to just make player A as miserable as possible, how close can I get you to the start of the board? It doesn't matter if I win the game or not. I just want you to feel like you are never going to win. What is that game experience like? Probably kind of fun for one player and not fun at all for the other player. So you, the designer, are responsible for, if that is a rule that you put in your game, you're responsible for that emergent behavior when a narcissist plays your game. So you have to think about all of the ways that your rules could be interpreted. What do your rules allow for? What are the emergent behaviors from those rules? Not just what would you do, what could anyone do? Concept of emergent narrative. Instead of narrative being static, it can be player driven. Something like D&D, where the player makes decisions and then the DM goes back and creates the game world around the player's decisions, might steer the players a little bit towards something they've created, but a good DM is capable of revealing the world around the player's decisions and keeping it engaging. So there can be an emergent narrative out of the player's choices.
Yeah, Dark Souls is a masterclass in this. They just put a bunch of random information. The community came up with a bunch of theories, and then in the next game they were like, "All right, what you guys said was right in a lot of ways."
Yeah,
Pretty great.
yeah, and that can be very cool for design as well. The players tell you what they want out of your game world, and so you take that and use that to design and further add detail to the game universe.
Is it? I don't know why. I just want to ask. Does this constitute as something where it's like Twitch plays Pokemon, where it's like there's a narrative over the fact that everyone keeps making the character look at like a fossil for some reason? It's like there's a narrative like, oh my god, he's consoling the fossil, even though it does nothing. Is that part of it, or is it...
If they designed it in a later game where that fossil did something, because that became a meme, then that would kind of be emergent narrative in that sense. Or if you somehow coded an Easter egg where if you stared at a fossil for more than 5 minutes, then the fossil responds to you in some way, shape, or form. That might be emergent based on the way that you interacted with the world around you.
Okay, gotcha.
Could Easter eggs be an example kind of like emergent narrative? Like, even though sometimes like it's probably not super related to the
If you
plot.
added it later, it would be more emergent. So if you patch it into your game, because that's how the community engages with it, then it becomes more emergent. You're changing the world based on how the players are engaging. To understand your dynamics, you really need to play test games. You can think in your head about how this is going to play out all you want, but until you actually sit down with people and play it, you will not have a great idea of how that's going to go. Even no matter how experienced you are, you get surprised by the rules that you create and the emergent behavior that comes out of the rules that you create. So we're going to go into a lot of detail about playtesting. How do you do this? What should you be looking at? What should you be considering? What data should you make note of? How should you use that data to incorporate into the feedback, into the iteration of your game's design? But playtesting is a huge part of game dev. All right, so that's Tracy Fullerton's system. Another system is the elemental tetrad. This was presented by Jesse Schell in The Art of Game Design. It's made up of, as you might imagine with the word tetrad, 4 components, but they're spread over 3 layers. So the first, and these are going to sound similar to MDA and similar to Tracy Fullerton's system, but they're different ways of thinking about the design of a game. It's not to say that any one of these are right or wrong. They're just different ways that we have come upon understanding a game system. So mechanics, these are the rules for interaction between player and game. We have the aesthetics. How is the game perceived by your senses? There's the technology, all of the underlying technology that makes the game work. And finally, we have the story. So it's not just the story itself, it really does cover all of Tracy Fullerton's dramatic elements. So there are your 4 components of the tetrad. Any questions on those? Yeah.
You said they were kind of like layered into like 3 different like situations. I assume aesthetics and story are the ones that are like paired
They're actually
together.
all 4 at all 3 layers.
Interesting.
So now there are 12 components. So we're going to talk about how these 4 components can be layered in such a way that, yeah, we'll see how that goes. That's a good question. So there is the tetrad itself. And we see that aesthetics are very visible in the game. When you're playing a game, your senses are, what you see is a large part of the game. What you hear can be a large part of the game. The technology that's used, on the other hand, is very not visible. What are the underlying algorithms that make this possible? You have to have studied that in order to have a sense of or a hint at how the designers created the game world out of the underlying technology. Even in a board game, how does the technology, why is this balanced? If we're using a spinner of some kind, why are the wedges of the spinner the size that they are? All of that is the underlying technology of why this works. Our last little bit here, we're going to go grab we did grab 3. I'm jumping ahead of myself. An entire thing on the layered tetrad. That makes much more sense. All right, diving into the layered tetrad in a lot more detail. So all the frameworks we talked about, Shell tried to get into this system. Kind of a catch-all, how can we look at a game in layers? So the elemental tetrad was one of those layers, but now we're going to layer that tetrad on top of itself. So 3 layers, each of which is made up of one of those tetrads. There's the inscribed layer. These are the aspects of the game that exist when it is not being played. Very interesting concept. The game as it exists in theory.
Interesting.
There's the dynamic layer. What are the aspects of the game immediately as it is being played? Then there's the cultural layer describing the game beyond the gameplay itself. How are people talking about the game? What are the memes that have been created? What are the mods that have been created? Things that are outside of the scope of the design of the game. So we're going to take a look at the tetrad from each one of these layers. So we're going to start with the inscribed layer, which again is the game as it exists in theory. And we're going to go into detail of the tetrad for that. So the mechanics, this is almost from a design perspective. Before you've had a chance to play the game itself, how does the game exist as the rules? How is the game going to work? The design that goes into it while it's not being played. So the game's rules are part of the inscribed mechanics. The player interaction patterns, you can decide this game is going to be player versus environment. It's going to be 1 versus team. Whatever those player interaction patterns are, those are part of the inscribed layer. How does the game work? The objectives, the resources, the boundaries, everything that is thought up in the design phase of the game, those are all inscribed mechanics. Aesthetics were, again, how the game appeals to the five senses. But as you're writing the music for the soundtrack or coming up with an idea of what is the theme, how should the soundtrack tie together? If it's a horror game, then what is the creepiness of the different aspects of the soundtrack? The design of that exists in the inscribed layer. These aren't the actual tracks as they're being listened to. They're the tracks as they're being designed, as they're being created.
It's like the dream board or the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any character models, if you're doing any art in preparation for making this game, here's what this character is going to look like. I'm going to do this sketch as to who I think is going to be in this story and what they look like and what their background is. Why are they wearing what they're wearing? How, etc. The packaging and cover art, that exists outside of the scope of the game. So your marketers, how are you selling the game? How are you preparing the game? How are you showing the game to people to try to convince them to play it? Technology, anything underlying that makes the game work, because it was needed to construct the game in the first place. So Unity is not something that is necessarily used when the game is run, but it's something that is used when the game is created. So any underlying technology that was needed to create the game. Narrative, story, characters, premise, plot, just anything that is pre-scripted, nothing that is generated based on how the player interacts with the game, but everything the designers intended when they created the game. Summary of the dynamic layer. So now this is what's happening as the game is being played. So the dynamic mechanics are how players are interacting with the inscribed mechanics. So any procedures, as we mentioned for procedures, strategies that the players come up with, any emergent game behavior, and how the game ends. How a particular game session ends. All of those are dynamic. They're based on how the game is being played and players' interactions with that. Aesthetics. What does the player sense during the time that they are playing the game? This can include any procedural art. It's not something that the designers created outside of the scope of the game. It's generated on the fly as the game is being played. So the procedural algorithm would be part of the prior layer, the inscribed layer. But the actual art that is created by the procedural generator would be in the dynamic layer. If you get carpal tunnel from clicking a bunch, that's in the dynamic layer for aesthetics, the pain that you feel from overexerting yourself. Dynamic technology. How does the technology work during play? This can be something like, how does the AI perform? So if you're playing an RTS, for instance, what is the rate of the difficulty of the technology development of a computer-driven player? How well does that challenge you? How do you feel about how that challenge affects you? Any deviations from expected probabilities? If you expect to get a 6, 7, or 8 when you roll 2d6 and you get a 2, or anything outside of what you might expect or what is likely from that, that can change how a player feels or experiences the game because it wasn't quite what the developers intended in the long run.
I think this is something that I've learned when in the later Civ games, because they'd have like statistics of like, hey, how likely is this to succeed when doing battle and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Is they realize that players would assume that if it says like there's a 66% chance, that means 2 out of 3 times they would succeed, but they would like transliterate that to being 2 out of every 3 times must succeed. So if I fail once,
Right.
then I must succeed twice to equal that out. So I can't fail twice in a row. Or that if I
This
fail,
is why we need education.
yeah, well, 90%, then this is weird. So it's like there is also a disconnect between actual statistics.
Yeah, last one, I know we're just about out of time here, but any story that emerges out of the game systems. So any branching narrative, any particular path through that branching narrative because of a player's choices. Any, if you play The Sims, a particular character's path through the dynamic The Sims. A curse from a long playoff absence in sports. That becomes a narrative that is made out of the actual game being played and deviations from what you might expect. So the Mariners World Series curse is a dynamic narrative that's created out of just the fact that we've had a garbage front office for as long as we can remember. Maybe that changes soon.
It looked like it was.
All right, we'll come back and talk about this more.
Sorry.
On Monday. Have a great weekend. Go play some games. Yeah. Okay.